All right, everyone, get ready because today we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into the mind of one of history's biggest thinkers, Rene Descartes.
It's going to be a good one.
You guys wanted the full deep dive on Descartes, and believe me, there's way more to this guy than just that I think, therefore I am, quote, everyone knows.
Oh, absolutely. To really get Descartes, you got to understand, like, he was seriously not satisfied with the way people back then just accepted the way things were.
Yeah.
He wanted to rebuild knowledge from scratch, like starting from the ground up and find a foundation of, like, absolute certainty.
Rebuilding knowledge. Wow, that's a pretty ambitious goal to have, to say the least.
Yeah.
What was it that made him decide to take on such a, well, radical project?
Well, imagine living in a time where, like, everything you thought you knew was being challenged, like major intellectual upheaval. That was Descartes' world. The Renaissance was in full swing, changing how people thought about, well, everything. And Descartes, he took this whole question everything idea to a whole other level, yeah.
So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah. His main tool, something called methodological skepticism.
Methodological skepticism. Okay, so he was, what, like a professional doubter?
In a way, yeah, you could say that. But his doubt wasn't about being difficult or anything. He genuinely wanted to strip away all assumptions, like every preconceived notion. He thought by doing that, he could uncover those, like, rock-solid truths, the ones that hold up even when you're doubting everything else.
And that is where his famous quote comes in, right? I think, therefore I am. But that wasn't just him trying to come up with a catchy phrase, was it?
Nope, not at all.
This is a pretty key part of his philosophy.
Totally. Cogito ergo sum. That's how it goes in Latin. It's like the cornerstone of Descartes' whole system of thought. Think about it. Even when you're doubting everything, Descartes realized there's one thing you just can't doubt. The fact that you're doubting. To doubt, you have to exist, at least as a thinking thing.
Whoa. Okay, now that is a real mind bender when you stop and think about it.
Yeah.
So, okay, he proves we exist because we think. Got it. But then what did Descartes think? About what this thinking thing is, this mind. Like, how did he think it fits in with our physical bodies?
Ah, well, that's where we get into one of his most influential and definitely most debated ideas, the concept of mind-body dualism. So Descartes, he was convinced that the mind and the body, yeah, they're connected, sure, but they're totally different things deep down, like fundamentally different. This is what we call Cartesian dualism.
Two totally separate things, huh? That seems kind of, I don't know, counterintuitive, right? I mean, when I go for a run or something, I feel great, but like mentally and physically.
Yeah, it's definitely a concept that's had philosophers scratching their heads for centuries, that's for sure. What Descartes believed was that the mind, that non-physical part of us, where our thoughts are, feelings, consciousness itself, he thought that exists independently from our physical bodies. Like, it's not bound by those same material rules. He imagined the body more like a machine, actually.
A machine.
Yeah, like it follows all those laws of physics and whatnot. But the mind, that operates on a whole other level, at least according to Descartes.
Okay, so like to use a modern comparison or whatever, it's kind of like my mind is the software and my body is just the hardware it runs on.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And believe me, that idea had some serious mileage on it. It shaped how we understand consciousness, the self, even sparked debates about, like, science versus religion. Big stuff.
Speaking of debate, I know Descartes had people who disagreed with him. Like, were there any big counter-arguments to this whole dualism thing?
Oh, absolutely. One guy who really pushed back against Descartes was Baruch Spinoza, this Dutch philosopher. He was more into this idea called monism. Basically, he believed the mind and body weren't two separate things, but like two sides of the same coin, two ways of experiencing one underlying substance.
Okay, so a very different perspective. It does seem like, though, that Descartes really got the ball rolling on this whole discussion, huh? Like, centuries of philosophical debate about consciousness and how our minds and bodies connect, it all kind of traces back to him.
Yeah.
And that debate is still going on even today with all this talk about artificial intelligence and whatnot.
Exactly. If Descartes were around right now, I bet he'd be super fascinated by AI, like whether a machine could ever really think the way he imagined the mind could. But hey, let's switch gears a bit here. Let's dig into how Descartes thought we acquire knowledge in the first place. It's a big part of his philosophy, this whole idea of epistemology. And he was a big proponent of what we call rationalism, which is all about the power of reason, like reason over just relying on our senses.
So it's not just about what we observe out in the world, but how our minds take that information and, like, make sense of it, right? Tell me more. I'm intrigued.
That's the heart of it. You see, Descartes, he was kind of suspicious of our senses. He knew they could be tricked, like think about optical illusions or even dreams. Those are cases where what we're seeing or experiencing isn't like the actual truth of things. For Descartes, true, reliable knowledge, it came from the mind's ability to reason things out, to apply logic and deduction, all that good stuff. And he had this really interesting argument to back this up, what's known as the wax argument, I think you'd call it.
Okay, so reason over senses, got it. But like, how'd that work in practice? How do we use this reason to actually figure out what's true?
Well, Descartes had some pretty fascinating ideas about that. One of his most famous examples is this thing called the wax argument. Picture this. You've got a piece of wax, right? You can see it, you can smell it, feel how hard it is.
Sure, yeah,
Now imagine you take that wax and you melt it. What happens to all those things you just experienced? They all change, don't they?
totally. Melted wax is like a totally different experience for your senses.
Exactly. But here's the key thing, right? Our minds, they still understand that it's the same piece of wax, even though all those sense things are different now. To Descartes, this wasn't just some random observation, this was huge. It proved that reason, it lets us grasp the essence of something, what it really is, in a way that our senses just can't do alone.
That's a really clever example, I gotta admit.
Hmm.
So our minds can kind of see past the surface changes and get to the like fundamental nature of the wax.
Yeah.
Is that also why Descartes was so into math and science?
Yeah.
Because they rely so much on this logic and reasoning, going beyond just what we perceive with our senses?
Exactly. He saw the entire universe as this like perfectly ordered machine, kind of like a clock running on these unchanging mathematical laws.
Right.
He even made some big contributions to math himself. Remember learning about the Cartesian coordinate system?
Oh yeah, graphing and all that.
That was all him.
Wow. I had no idea. See, this is what I love about these deep dives, always learning new things.
Right. It just goes to show you Descartes' influence is way bigger than just philosophy books. But we can't talk about Descartes without at least mentioning his views on God.
Right, because he was a religious guy, wasn't he? For all his skepticism and reason and what have you.
He was, and that's where things get a little more, shall we say, complex. See, Descartes had his own version of this thing called the ontological argument for God's existence.
The ontological argument.
Sounds complicated. It can be, yeah. To put it simply, though, Descartes' version basically argues that the very idea of God, like a perfect being, it automatically means he has to exist. It's like saying that existing is part of being perfect.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So our minds can imagine this perfect being, and if perfection means existence,
Then God must exist, yeah. It's a pretty wild idea, and it was a really important piece of Descartes' overall philosophy. He even used this idea of a non-deceiving God to justify why we can actually trust our senses, at least to some degree. Remember we talked about that evil demon thought experiment where he imagines our senses being tricked by like a malicious spirit?
Oh yeah, like we're all stuck in a simulation or something.
Exactly. But Descartes argued that a good God wouldn't create us only to be constantly fooled by our senses. So reason should always be our guide, yeah. But our senses, backed up by a benevolent God, they still have a role to play in figuring out how the world works.
So we come full circle. Descartes takes us on this journey through skepticism, but ultimately, there's a way back to trusting our perception of the world.
Sort of, yeah. But it's not about blind faith. For Descartes, it always comes back to using our reason the right way. We've got to be critical, question what we see and hear, and figure out what's real knowledge versus just sensory illusions.
Which, honestly, feels more important today than ever, don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, we're constantly bombarded with information, and it's easy to feel lost in it all. Descartes reminds us to, like, never stop thinking for ourselves, you know?
That's exactly why he's still so relevant. He's like a wake-up call to challenge our assumptions, ask for proof, and never just accept things at face value. Our minds are powerful tools, and how we use them shapes our entire reality, really.
So, if Descartes were here with us right now, what do you think he'd be most skeptical of? Like, what are we taking for granted that he'd immediately start picking apart?
That is the question, isn't it? What unquestioned assumptions are we carrying around with us? What would it take to actually put them to the test? That's the legacy of Descartes, you know? It's not about having all the answers, but about having the guts to keep asking questions, to never stop exploring, and always be ready to challenge what we think we know.
And on that note, we'll leave you all to ponder that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of Rene Descartes.